I'm Emily Freeman. I'm a developer advocate for a startup called Kickbox. We do email verification. And I'm from Denver, Colorado. So it's only my second time in New York. I'm super excited to be here with you all. And impressed with all the Python talks and everything so far. Scaling systems is hard. But we're developers. That's kind of our thing. Scaling people? Well, that's significantly harder. People are complicated. Broadly speaking, I think companies have 3 stages of development. Infancy, those awkward teenage years, and if they survive the trials of adolescence, adulthood. An infant startup is so drastically different from its adult incarnation that they could be considered different companies. Each will have a unique mission and culture. Scaling isn't just about making what you have bigger. An ant can't be scaled to the size of an elephant. The internal structure is fundamentally different. Instead, companies have to evolve. But companies aren't living, breathing organisms. They're collections of people, like you and me, akin to families, tribes, civilizations. So how do you scale a team of 2 to 20 to 200? Well, the answer starts over 2,000 years ago in Sparta. This talk is going to focus on 3 major military organizations: the Spartans, the Mongols, and the Romans. Sparta's standing army was relatively small, whereas Rome's peaked at nearly 500,000. We'll look at the organization of each military, their processes, how they treated their soldiers, and apply those lessons learned to our own organizations and teams. Whether you're scaling an army of soldiers or developers, almost everything comes down to communication and collaboration. How do you keep people informed and working together toward a single goal? If your team is small, it's no big deal. In those early days, it's just a few of you probably in the same room, coding. You can just yell at each other when you have a question, or you have most of the code base in your head. There's not a lot of process. But as your team gets bigger, more and more intersections of communication develop. And by that, I mean how many ways one person can speak to everyone else in the team. With that, there's more opportunities for miscommunication. There's actually a formula for this. I was kind of surprised. Don't worry, I'll spare you the math. For a team of 5 folks, you have 10 communication intersections. That's not so bad. For a team of 10, it jumps to 45. A team of 15 brings us to 105 communication connections. And just doubling that team to 30 brings us to 435 ways your team can communicate with each other. 435 for a team of 30. Is anyone else overwhelmed? Because I feel like this, adorable, but yet definitely melancholy pug. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that scaling is messy, and it always will be. We don't exist in a vacuum. There's no petri dish in which to try different strategies and see what works. Often, due to resource constraints, we get one shot. And if we fail, well, that's it. But there are some things that we can do better as developers and as managers. So where do we start? With Sparta, our startup of the ancient world. They were small. At its largest, Sparta's standing army numbered about 10,000. And they were obsessed with what they did best: war. They also had a thing with nudity, but this conference has a code of conduct, so I'm not going to get into that. Most Greek city-states were fortified by a wall. Sparta said no. We're going to fortify our city with a wall of men. That's pretty bold. This obsession with war started on day 1. Newborns were bathed in wine. Don't worry, I don't get that aspect either. And then they were taken by their fathers to the Geruza, a council of elders, for inspection. Infanticide, unfortunately, was common in all Greek city-states, and Sparta was no exception. Newborns who were not strong enough were abandoned to die of exposure. At age 7, boys were taken to the Agos, a military training facility, and barracks. Girls were permitted to stay with their parents and actually educated and encouraged to exercise, which was unique in Greece. So yay for kind of equal rights. Spartans eschewed all comforts. It's said that they were the only people for whom war was actually a reprieve from everyday life. Their staple diet was blood broth, exactly what it sounds like, and the boys of the Agos were regularly denied food and clothing. They were encouraged to steal, but beaten harshly if caught, not for stealing, but for being caught. Everything about the Agos hardened the soldiers for warfare. And at age 12, they hit their first real test. They were sent out into the wilderness with only a red cloak and expected to survive. At age 20, soldiers could join a syssitia. This was a sort of mess or club. Spartan peers and members of that club had to vote men in, and voting had to be unanimous. If a man was not admitted into a syssitia, by the time he was 30, he would not become a citizen of Sparta and instead occupy a lower standing. Men were permitted to marry at age 20, awesome, but they would stay away from their wives and children at the barracks until age 30. They would serve as reservists in the military until age 60. Imagine that. All Spartans were equal to their peers and submissive to the unit. Soldiers who lost their hoplon or shield were disgraced because that shield protected not only that soldier, but the man on his left. And this is that movement that you think of with Sparta. It's called a phalanx, when they're moving in close formation together. Spartans overall were a small tribe of intensely loyal, overworked, and underfed soldiers who took on the big boys of the ancient world. The Battle of Thermopylae pitted 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans, fighting to the death against over 100,000 Persians. And isn't that how every startup would like to imagine themselves? Maybe without the ab strength and rugged good looks? When you're in the startup phase, find what you do best. Spartans were the special forces of ancient Greece, but they were unmatched in war. If an ally was threatened, all they had to do was send one man. A single soldier dressed in that iconic red cloak was enough, because enemies knew that a fight with one Spartan soldier was a fight with all of Sparta. You're absolutely too young to be worried about anything but product market fit. You can A/B test all the things later. Hire generalists. You need people capable of solving just about any problem. Spartans didn't have unique training among their soldiers. They were all trained the same way, and they were equal. They used the same strategies. The people you need may not be up to date on the latest and greatest JavaScript framework from 2017, but they do have a certain grit, a dogged determination to figure it out. At this stage, specialists could hinder progress by narrowing their focus too early. Keep your team agile and focused on solving the problem most efficiently, not solving the problem using a specific tool. Allow natural communication pathways to form. A desire path is a path that's formed through erosion by people or animals marching over the same piece of grass over and over and over again. Communication follows a similar pattern. Observe who communicates with others most seamlessly. And when you need to delegate responsibility or bring something to the group, talk to that person and then have them bring it to everyone else. Take on the big boys. Listen, you've got 2 developers and 3 months of runway. You've got nothing to lose. The stats say you're going to crash and burn like everyone else. So screw that. Give it all you've got. 300 Spartans marched right up to 100,000 Persians and challenged them to a fight. Be bold. Worst case, you learn some valuable lessons. Best case, you become the big boy. The Mongols are by far my favorite of these organizations, and they are our analog for a mid-sized team. It's our sort of awkward teenager of an organization. The Mongol army topped out at about 100,000. It is, to this day, the largest geographic empire in the world. They conquered nearly all of continental Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe. Honestly, Mongols didn't show up or strike yourself as someone who would influence history the way that they did. As a people, they sat quietly in the foothills of Siberia, mastering archery and horsemanship. But like most nomadic tribes in harsh, brutal conditions, they were tough, like real tough. The Mongols and their conquests are forever married to Genghis Khan, or Chinggis, depending on who you ask. Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, was born in 1162 to an unremarkable and lowly tribe. His father was poisoned when he was young, and he was left to the care of his older brothers, one of whom he murdered in a fight. Tough guy. As a teenager, he married Borta, his first and most influential wife. Early in their marriage, she was kidnapped. This was actually fairly common in Mongolia at the time. And his rescue of her proved his military mettle. He eventually went on to unite the Mongol tribes. Unfortunately, he did this by instigating a civil war, but he was eventually named Great Khan and ruled over all of the Mongol Empire. Genghis was a brilliant military leader. Under his rule, Mongols conquered more land in 25 years than the Romans did in 400. He did this through a number of tactics. Mongols embraced religious tolerance. Conquered people could practice their religions freely. He promoted people on merit and brought people from lower classes into his tribes while doing away with the rich and powerful families. This made him extremely popular. Mongol society was pretty egalitarian. Like most nomadic civilizations, both men and women contributed to their success. So women didn't suffer the typical patriarchal domination that you see in other societies, minus the whole wife kidnapping thing. Haven't figured that one out. He reinvigorated the Silk Road. He ensured safe passage and enabled globalized trade. It was said that you could travel from one end of the Mongol Empire to the other carrying a gold plate and be completely safe. No one would bother you. They were uncommonly adaptable. Even though they had no experience with walled cities, they mastered siege warfare. Cities were often so afraid of slaughter that they surrendered as soon as the Mongols showed up. Mongols definitely left their mark. That much is sure. They defeated nations with over 100 times their manpower, which is kind of what a mid-sized company or late-stage startup needs to do. You've got that product market fit. Now it's time to build an empire. So how do we apply Genghis Khan's wisdom to our own teams? Avoid emotional decision-making. Above all else, Genghis Khan was a master strategist. In the early days, things are rocky. One day you'll land a company or a customer that'll pay this month's entire AWS bill, and the next month the site's down and investors are calling just to scream at you. Reactionary businesses rarely survive. So start to think in an OODA loop. OODA loop is not only a fun word to say, but it's actually a strategy created by Colonel John Boyd of the Air Force. And it stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. This will allow you to rapidly work through problems and prevent yourself from being bogged down by fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's even better if you can get inside your competitor's OODA loop and upend their strategy. Avoid micromanagement. This seems so obvious when you're an employee, but so blatantly, confusing if you're in a management position. Mongol officers and troops were usually given significant freedom by their superiors in executing orders. As long as the larger objectives were met, Mongol soldiers could solve a problem basically however they saw fit. In other words, they focused on what, not how. As you grow, I want you to keep your team focused on the larger mission, whatever that is, but give them room to do their job. And that includes enabling autonomy. Each Mongol soldier typically maintained 3 to 4 horses. Because they swapped horses frequently, they could ride for days without exhausting their animals. They had an extraordinary ability to live off the land, and in extreme situations, they actually lived off their horses, mostly through mare's milk. Unlike other armies, they weren't dependent on supply logistics. Give your employees the resources they need to get the job done. Support them. And if you're in management, this means protecting them, especially from outside negative forces or higher up in the company. If the VP of product wants a feature done yesterday, that's your problem as a manager, not your dev team's. Figure it out. Stay small. Much like our modern military, the Mongol army was organized into small squads that together made up larger units. Growing doesn't mean that all your developers now report to a single manager who reports to a single VP who reports to the CTO, because I think we've all met an organization like that. I think instead, focus on keeping your employees in family-like structures of people that can merge into larger groups when needed. Start to introduce structure, but keep it simple, really simple. Now is not the time to go full Jira and hire a Scrum Master. Instead, implement a daily stand-up. Start tracking features and bugs on a whiteboard or using a very simple tracker tool. At this stage, too much communication is inefficient, and too little communication causes confusion. The last thing you want is two developers trying to fix the same bug, because that merged conflict is going to be ugly. Prevent yourself from falling into the trap of acting like a real company, whatever that means to you. I mean, yes, let's pay our taxes, please. But now is not the time to have an annual review process or very formal one-on-ones every week. You're just not there yet. Focus. It's easy at this stage to want to do all the things. Yes, your company could become the world's best to-do list for both stay-at-home parents and CEOs alike. But that's, I don't know, we're not there yet. Find your one market. Focus on your successful value add. A product for stay-at-home moms with small children is going to be very different from a manager's products to keep track of their direct reports. Once you have revenue and majority market share in one area, then you can start invading others. For now, stay focused. Lastly, if you survive the pimply, mistake-ridden years of scaling a startup into an enterprise, congratulations, you're Rome. And let me tell you, you do not want to be the guy who brings down Rome. Rome is our large-scale organization. Reliability and predictability have become much more critical. You're an empire now. It's more important to protect what you've built than it is to be a disruptor. This is where administration, management, and process eclipse rockstar developers and game-changing ideas. Rome was a nearly unstoppable force and one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. Its legacy continues to influence us in our daily life via language, law, government, religion, architecture, and more. The Roman Empire spanned nearly 2,000 years, and its military structure is a graduate-level course in and of itself. Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is nearly 4,000 pages long. There's no way I'm going to do it justice. But I am going to highlight the structure of the Imperial Roman Army when it reached its peak of about 450,000 in 211 AD. Emperor Augustus founded the Imperial Army. Prior to him, Rome motivated soldiers with grants of land and increased wealth. But as land became more scarce, they shifted toward rewarding soldiers with a set amount of denarii at the end of their service. For the legionnaires, this was equivalent to 13 years' salary. Kind of sounds like a pension, right? The Imperial Army was split into two groups. You can very simply consider them to be commissioned officers versus enlisted soldiers. The commissioned officers were assigned to legions, heavy infantry made up of 5,000 Roman citizens each. Long-term professional soldiers who served 25-year terms, and conscription was only decreed in emergencies. In addition to the legions, the auxilia was established. These enlisted troops were recruited from the peregrini, non-citizen residents. The auxilia supplied infantry, cavalry, archers, and special forces. Auxiliaries were awarded Roman citizenship at the end of their service. The army also employed numeri, mercenaries from allied people outside the empire. We today know these people as contractors. Legionnaires enjoyed greater social status, higher pay, better equipment, but organizationally, every province had a legati, a legion commander, who reported to the provincial governor, and that governor actually reported directly to the Emperor of Rome. So it's a flatter structure than I would have imagined. The commander of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal guard, acted as the de facto military chief of staff and advised him in Rome. While the legionnaires held a higher status, they depended heavily on the auxilia. Legions were entirely heavy infantry, foot soldiers in metal armor. They were almost unbeatable by other infantry, but could not campaign independently, just like developers would be lost without teams like QA and DevOps. So what can we glean from Rome? Break into small teams. This sounds familiar at this point. We do the same thing with our applications. When a class gets too big, we abstract logic away into a smaller component. The same principle applies to people. But allow divisions to form naturally. Each unit in the Roman army had its own standard, which is a pole with a variety of decorations, a bit of a flag. The practical use was to visually communicate to a soldier where the bulk of his unit was on a battlefield. But for soldiers, standards held deep meaning. Soldiers believed their standards represented a divine spirit. They prayed to them. It represented the soul of the unit and brought everyone together, much like a country's flag does for its citizens. Set a clear vision. Think of the small teams you just formed as little Spartas. Go back to those fundamentals and allow each to have autonomy. But be clear about the broader vision. Teams without a focused goal will naturally prioritize the things they're interested in, not necessarily the things that are best for the company. Leadership must regularly communicate the direction of the larger organization, where they're headed, and why. The why is even more important than the what, because it provides context and clarity. And be careful about how many times you move the cheese. It's absolutely okay to pivot or change direction, but doing that every quarter or rearranging teams constantly, it will undermine you and your organization. When your word means nothing, people stop listening. Become masters of logistics and planning. When you're big, logistics matter. Romans invested heavily in extensive and well-maintained roads. This allowed their troops to move freely when needed. In addition, the Roman military dedicated a specialized branch to logistics and transportation. While smaller armies could forage or buy or steal food and supplies, Romans, their military was just too big. Instead, deployed forces relied heavily on a very complex and widespread network of supply chains. For modern development teams, I think this is akin to project management. Agile, Scrum, Extreme Programming, Kanban, it doesn't really matter, I don't care, pick one, and then commit to it. If you choose Agile, do Agile, not your special snowflake version of product just wants to add this one little feature to the sprint version of Agile. The more logistical thinking you can remove from your developers means the more time they have to dedicate to the thing they do best, which is solving problems. Invest in your employees. Take care of them. This means encouraging work-life balance. And if you don't know what that means, let's start with not allowing your employees to work more than 40 hours a week. And you may be thinking, but, this feature really needs to go out. Why? Is it because you set an unfair expectation? Or is it because the calendar says it needs to go out? We're developers. Emergencies happen, we get it. If the site's down or something's crashing, we're not heading out the door because we're at our 40-hour mark. But those emergencies are few and far between. Working around the clock or checking email constantly at home doesn't make your employees hard workers. It makes them former employees. The Roman army had a vested interest in the health and well-being of their soldiers. They developed sophisticated medical knowledge and practices, and for good reason. A sick soldier couldn't be relied on to campaign or defend a city. Offering generous insurance is important. So is having conversations about mental health and burnout. Anxiety and depression affect huge swaths of our industry, and many of us in this room, including myself, deal with something on a regular, if not daily, basis. Engineering can be lonely, grueling work. We sit alone for hours at a machine, punching in new commands, and having that computer just sit there and print out errors at us, literally yelling at you for not coding well enough. Simply recognizing how hard your team works and acknowledging that everyone needs breaks, promoting frequent work-free vacations will do wonders for the longevity of your team. Introduce those specialists, or allow your generalists to become specialists. As your team forms, sit down with each employee and discuss their goals, both professionally and personally. Some generalists will be interested in management, many will not. Allocating team members at the beginning may feel arbitrary, but if you allow some flexibility and movement between teams, each person will slowly find his or her niche. We've been talking about this for a couple years now, but there's still monoliths or, microservices that look like monoservices. If yours is this, it might be a really good time. Services are great because it allows your employees to explore and use new languages. One service can be written in Go, another in Ruby. It allows them to be creative and explore. And finally, have honest conversations, no matter your size. Conflict is uncomfortable, I get it. We avoid it at all costs often, but it's an absolute requirement to scaling a team. Know where your employees thrive. People that thrive when there's 2 developers and endless pots of coffee may not do so well as you scale. It sucks to see good people go, but that's all right. It's important to have those conversations and make sure that everyone is content and fulfilled by their work. You know your team's best. Some of the data in here applies to you, some of it doesn't. Make sure that you follow your instincts, communicate, and pitch in when you can. No one wants to follow a leader who wasn't willing to roll up his or her sleeves when needed. Thank you.